What are the possible legal mechanisms whereby the UK might be able to achieve grandfathering of the European Union's free trade agreements? Who wants to kick off? Philippe.
It's a difficult but obviously interesting question. First of all, we have to consider what can be understood under the notion of grandfathering. I think grandfathering as meaning that the existing treaties just continue to apply to the UK after leaving the Union without there being any need for renegotiation or agreement by the third party, by the other party to the agreement, I think is impossible. That would not be an option which can be based on any legal provisions of public international law. So there are other ways of doing that, which are not strictly speaking grandfathering, but for instance, one could consider a possibility of the UK acceding to the existing agreements, whereby actually the agreements would become an agreement, for instance, between EU27, UK, and let's say Korea. Now the problem with that is that it would obviously require acceptance by the EU27, and in the example here Korea, and would probably also need again to go to the whole conclusion and ratification process in the EU, which means that we would have to go before all the national parliaments, which would obviously be again very time consuming and difficult to realize and to conclude in a very short time.
If we have a hard Brexit and crash out in March 2019, tariffs will go up with 27 countries. If we don't have agreements with these tariffs will go up with 63 more countries. So is it possible then that the UK would have increased tariff and increased trade barriers, probably the best way, with 80 countries?
Yes. I mean, you'll have both the
trade... 90 countries, my reference.
You'll have both the trade barriers that exist because we no longer have a trade agreement or arrangement with those countries, and we therefore fall back onto what's being loosely called as WTO terms, but the international framework that otherwise exists. Yeah. And it's not just the tariffs, but of course the non-tariff barriers, which certainly most of my clients are as concerned about, if not more concerned about, than the tariffs themselves, which is around how you exchange, how you deliver goods and receive goods, and the paperwork that's involved around that, as well as things like rules of origin and other issues which impact significantly on the way they produce products and the way they export in the markets that they are trying to trade with.
So let's say Korea has a deal with the EU, yeah, but it differs between individual states?
For instance, in services, you can have reservations in your schedule for the services. So if Korea negotiates and says, I give, let's say, free access to insurance services, yeah, in the Korean market, you will find then in the schedule a number of reservations whereby individual member states say, yes, but not for life insurance, or not for public health insurance. And this is done on an individual country basis.
Right.
Now, and we may have the UK, let's say, saying a reservation there that you cannot offer, Korean companies cannot offer in the UK health, yeah, insurance, for example. Now, if Korea was negotiating that, they obviously look at the overall package of all the member states, because they have given access to their market, and then they look what have they received in the European Union by looking. If now you cut out of there only the UK, this is a substantive change in the balance of obligations between the parties, because it may not be worth to have.
It strikes me though that if you cut and paste, they're not, with all the reservations in the schedules for the United Kingdom, wherever they happen to be, yeah, they're going to be no worse off than they currently are they?
They could be. For instance, if there are reservations entered by the UK, which Korea accepts because they had a good deal with France.
Yeah. So because if for a particular country they have done a deal with all of the EU because they really have 50% of their trade is with France, or Germany or wherever. So for them, the important point was to access that market, to which they also can give a lot of concessions for access to their market. Right. If the UK is a much smaller market for them...
Well, Andrew, can I just reverse that then? Because this deal done between Canada and the European Union, I understand one of the major reasons they wanted to do it is because of the United Kingdom. Yeah. All of a sudden, they're going to look at what they're left with the European Union and say, we're not really happy with that.
Well, two things. Firstly, you're absolutely right. The example we've given goes both ways. So we're not here to take a doom and gloom position, but to help you form your position. But so yes, it can go both ways. Canada is a good example. There may not be so many other examples, but of course, and that then impacts upon the negotiation with those particular countries. So those where there's a balance of trade in favour of the UK, of course, I'm sure they'll be very keen to ensure there is no gap at the point of the UK's departure. Those where we're in a different position, where we're more the demandeur, they have more negotiating leverage on their side as we enter into those discussions. But yes, so it does go both ways. Yeah.
But on that point, I'm not saying that there would not be an interest to have a cut and paste. I'm just saying that it's very difficult to do it in practice, that you cannot just copy-paste the agreement, that all the provisions will have to go through. For instance, agreement with Korea, there's a reference made on the protection of geographical indications of origin, which are identified by reference to the EU legislation on geographical indications of origin, which after Brexit will no longer apply. So there has to be a substitute in the agreement for that. And so there are numerous examples of that. So just to come back on a previous remark about during the transition period, we will be able to negotiate. Yes, but it's not sure that the agreements continue to apply during the transition period without being some active drafting and protocols added to the agreements. Because during the transition period, the UK will no longer be a member of the EU. And I understand that you will no longer be part of the single market. So most of the free trade agreements, the scope of application refers to the territory where the provisions of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union applies.
And of course, we're not sure if we have a transition period at all. It's not been agreed to yet by the EU27.
Do you not agree that simple changes to the current treaty framework could be actually very quick and straightforward if there's the will to do that, which we've just discussed, relative to negotiating completely new FTAs?
Well, I must say that obviously there is an interest. The UK is an important market, is an important country. But countries, and certainly the kind of countries where you have a real trade interest, will want to optimize their benefits.
So that's a renegotiation?
Yeah, that's a renegotiation.
But it's just a clarification, that you could just clarify that point. That's a change to the current treaty framework rather than a brand new FTA that you're advocating there.
Well, you cannot just roll over existing FTAs. There will always have to be some form of renegotiation.
But it's not brand new. You can start from that.
No, but you will look at the points where you have a real trade interest and where you think that some changes are necessary because the text is inappropriate or because the balance of concessions has been completely overturned.
If the legalities were invoked over the practicalities, and say South Korea wanted to renegotiate with the EU, is that not further detriment? Would that be further detriment to the UK because the EU would be a priority as a bigger, and then they would deal with the EU before they would get round to dealing with the UK? Is that a reading, or would they do it simultaneously?
I don't think the reality ends up being quite so hierarchical in reality, because these countries are looking at multiple negotiations going on at different times, depending on where their particular market interest is, change of political circumstances, whatever it may be. So I don't think that would change the dynamic.
You wouldn't be waiting in a queue, as it were?
Dramatically. Yeah. Not necessarily, but I think the key thing for all these countries, they're going to want to know what the UK's relationship and trading relationship is with the EU, because that will impact significantly on the scope they have to negotiate with the UK in the future. So it's two building blocks. One is the UK's relationship with the EU, and one is the UK's position in WTO. And that will effectively shape as much, what the third country agreements end up looking like and the scope for negotiation there. So most countries will want to know, and there may be a slight distinction between existing countries with existing agreements and new agreements, but they want to know what the UK's trade policy is going to be, and they want to look at what the final outcome is with the EU.
Are there any indications out there at all in terms of those existing that there's a conversation as we're saying we do want a negotiation very early? Because what we're hearing and what we've heard so far is that that is simply not the case. That's what the department's telling us. Everybody is willing. And I think the key thing to renegotiation is the willingness of the partners to ensure the practicalities are over are seamless. Likewise, as you've indicated just a few moments ago in terms of the EU.
I'm fully aware, but there's a fundamental difference between the position of the EU and the position of the UK after Brexit. After Brexit, the EU remains a full party to the existing agreements. After Brexit, the UK has no longer an agreement. So they need to come to a new agreement, which implies a negotiation. And that's a fundamental difference.
But it implies a negotiation depending on the willingness of each of the partners.
No,
so
you will have to go. You will have to go to the third party, to the country FTA party, and say, "Look, I'm interested in negotiating or in rolling over an existing FTA," and the other party will have to say, "Yes, we're also interested, but."
It's the but here, because I'm sure all countries will be interested in talking and looking to have an agreement with the UK after it leaves the EU and to ensure continuity of trade. The question is the but, and yes, so I'm sure they are willing to do so, and I'm sure I'm almost certain they would have said so to Secretary of State. The question is, what is that? Is there a but, and if so, what is it? Is it about actually getting slightly better quotas than they might otherwise have on frozen chickens into the UK, or is it about changing the entire structure? And that's a different question, and that comes down to what are those trade flows and what are the interests.
I've got a lot of alarm bells ringing in my ears about this whole expectation that things can be just sort of simply cut and paste and grandfathered and everything will be fine. The Department for International Trade, who were responsible for this, they had a previous minister, Lord Price, who tweeted out quite famously, quote, "All have agreed to roll over." All have agreed to roll over. That was his statement. In fact, the current Minister of State, Greg Hands, then retweeted it saying #facts matter. So I'm slightly worried that we've got a bit of naivety within our government department. So my question is quite simply, there aren't any actual legal agreements signed, sealed, done to roll over. That's question one. That's my understanding, but I don't know whether that's right.
Yes, I mean, and strictly speaking, the UK is still a member of the EU, so it couldn't agree on that basis. So not only is there a duty of law cooperation where, in theory, the UK cannot go off and negotiate agreements, though I think there's a sort of a reality check of those agreements that exist and new ones, but also there is, we remain a part of the EU, so therefore our ability to conclude on those agreements wouldn't be possible.
So actually, if they haven't all rolled over, there's a big job of work to be done to get to the state of rolling over, still to be done, still to get the negotiations, the agreements. I think it's quite important for you to just articulate the effort and the time involved in order to do that, because I'm really worried that we've got a department that is operating under this sort of naive state that everything's going to be simple and just can be done, well, if not before the transitional period, but easily within the 2-year period. In your legal experience, can you just articulate how this isn't just a simple matter?
Well, as we know, in Article 2.1 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, the UK is precluded from engaging in trade negotiations before it exits the EU. That doesn't mean, obviously, from a pragmatic viewpoint, although there are some lawyers taking an extremist view there, an extreme view there, that you cannot talk to the. You can have negotiations. You can have discussions. You can have discussions, but not real negotiations. Yeah, correct. And you
those
can,
discussions, I'm sure, must be having.
So that means that there cannot be a binding commitment to roll over existing FTAs. As I was trying to say, is if you want to roll over the FTAs, there will need to be a revisiting of the text of the agreements, which can be a cleaning up of the references to EU, replacing EU legislation, references to EU legislation, to UK legislation, etc. But there will also need to be renegotiation of tariff rate quota, of certain commitments that are there, because they're just not transposable to the UK alone. So that requires an international negotiation, which takes time. Which takes time because you will have to consult with your industries, whether that is acceptable, what they want to give, what are the interests. So that takes time. It's not something that you can do in a back room of the Foreign Office. You will have to go out to the industry concerned. And then, most importantly, no third country in its right mind will negotiate and conclude a deal without knowing what will be the trade relationship between the UK and the EU. It makes a big difference for Japan if they can ship their cars from the UK to the EU duty-free, or if they will have to pay an import duty. And that will affect enormously the kind of concession they want to accept, on, for instance, for car components.